On the evening of May 31st, 2025, under the warm glow of Spanish streetlights, holidaymakers packed into an Irish pub in Fuengirola, a resort town on Spain's Costa del Sol. The Champions League final had just ended, and the crowd, a mix of British expats, tourists and locals, erupted in celebration. Among them, two middle-aged Scotsmen, Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr., raised their pints in a toast. They were lifelong friends, men who had grown up together in the grey housing estates of North Glasgow, survived decades in Scotland's violent underworld, and believed they had finally found refuge in the Mediterranean sun. But in the crowd, two women watched them with unusual focus, their eyes tracking every movement, every gesture. Moments later, a masked figure appeared at the pub entrance, a handgun raised. The crack of gunfire shattered the festive atmosphere. Monaghan and Lyons fell amid overturned chairs and shattered glass, as panicked screams echoed through the narrow street. In the chaos, one of the watching women calmly spoke into her phone, then disappeared into the night. The gunman vanished just as quickly. Within seconds, two of Scotland's most notorious gangland figures lay dying on the tiled floor of a holiday pub, victims of a brazen assassination that had been planned across multiple countries, coordinated through encrypted messaging, and executed with surgical precision. This was not a random act of violence. It was the latest strike in a blood feud that has consumed two criminal families for nearly a quarter century, transforming city streets into battlefields and dragging a modern European nation into a cycle of revenge that seems impossible to break. Before we go deeper into this chilling true story, subscribe if you love real crime documentaries that explore the dark history behind headlines, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The Lyons versus Daniel crime family war represents something unique in the landscape of organized crime. A vendetta that has survived generational transitions, adapted to technological change, and spread from the housing schemes of Glasgow to the beaches of Spain and the luxury towers of Dubai. To understand how a dispute over stolen cocaine in 2001 led to international murder plots involving female spies, prison-based coordinators, and social media psychological warfare, we must first understand the world these men came from and the circumstances that made such a conflict not only possible, but seemingly inevitable. Glasgow, Scotland's largest city, has long carried a reputation for violence that dates back centuries. In the industrial era, overcrowded tenements and grinding poverty created fertile ground for gang culture. The 1930s saw the rise of the razor gangs, young men who carved up rivals with straight razors in territorial disputes over protection rackets. By the 1980s, Glasgow's gang landscape had evolved but remained brutal, exemplified by the infamous ice cream van turf wars, where competing drug dealers used ice cream routes as fronts for narcotics distribution. That conflict culminated in a firebombing that killed 6 members of one family, including an infant. It was against this backdrop of cyclical violence that the Lyons and Daniel families emerged as major players in Glasgow's criminal economy during the 1990s and early 2000s. The housing estates of Possilpark and Milton, located in North Glasgow, became the territorial heart of this emerging conflict. These neighborhoods, characterized by post-war high-rise flats and struggling local economies, provided both the manpower and the customer base for organized crime. Young men with limited legitimate opportunities found ready employment as street dealers, enforcers, and lookouts for the established crime families. The drug trade, particularly cocaine and heroin, generated enormous profits that allowed certain families to accumulate wealth and influence that extended far beyond their immediate neighborhoods. Two families in particular rose to prominence during this period: the Daniels, led by patriarch Jamie Daniel, and the Lyons, spearheaded by the ambitious Stephen Lyons. Jamie Daniel was by all accounts a traditional organized crime figure, calculating, cautious, and connected. He had built his network over years, establishing relationships with suppliers in Europe and distributors across Scotland. His operation was disciplined with clear hierarchies and understood rules. Family members and trusted associates controlled different aspects of the business: importation, distribution, money laundering, and enforcement. Daniel himself maintained a relatively low profile, avoiding the flashy displays of wealth that often attracted police attention. His enforcer network included seasoned criminals who understood the unwritten codes of Glasgow's underworld. Violence was acceptable when necessary, but always targeted, always purposeful. Among his most feared lieutenants was Kevin Carroll, a man whose nickname Gerbil belied his ruthless efficiency. Carroll's reputation for brutality made him both an asset and eventually a liability for the Daniel organization. Stephen Lyons represented a different breed of gangster, younger, more aggressive and impatient, to claim a larger share of Glasgow's lucrative drug market. Where Daniel had spent years building his empire brick by brick, Lyons sought to accelerate the process through bold moves and strategic alliances. He cultivated relationships with criminals outside Scotland, including contacts in Spain and Amsterdam, establishing supply routes that bypassed traditional gatekeepers. His inner circle included his son, Eddie Lyons Jr., and Eddie's close friend Ross Monaghan, men who would become central figures in the bloodshed to come. The Lyons operation was leaner and more opportunistic than the Daniel network, willing to take risks that the more established family avoided. This difference in approach would prove crucial to understanding what happened next. In 2001, a large shipment of high-purity cocaine belonging to the Daniel crime family was stolen from a safe house in Milton. The theft was not a sophisticated heist. Someone with inside knowledge had simply taken the drugs and disappeared. Investigators would later describe the amount as substantial, worth hundreds of thousands of pounds on the street. The thieves, according to underworld sources that later emerged, were Eddie Lyons Jr. and Ross Monaghan. Rather than negotiate, apologize, or attempt to make restitution, they allegedly sold the entire stash for profit, effectively robbing the Daniel family on their own territory. In the rigid code of Glasgow's criminal underworld, this was more than theft. It was a profound insult. A public declaration that the Lyons faction did not fear or respect the Daniel family's established dominance. Jamie Daniel faced an impossible choice. Let the insult stand and appear weak, inviting further challenges, or respond with force and risk igniting a full-scale war. He chose the latter. A blood feud was born. What followed was not an immediate explosion of violence, but rather a slow escalation, as both sides tested boundaries, assembled resources, and attempted to gauge their opponent's resolve. Throughout 2002 and into the early 2000s, Glasgow's criminal underworld buzzed with tension. Men who had once socialized together at the same pubs and social clubs now avoided each other or exchanged hostile glares. Both families began recruiting, not just traditional enforcers but younger men from the housing estates, teenagers hungry for status and money who could be molded into loyal soldiers. Weapons began circulating more freely. Handguns, previously rare in Scottish gang conflicts where knives and bats had been standard, became increasingly common. The Lyons faction, through Stephen's international connections, allegedly acquired firearms from contacts in Europe. The Daniel family, relying on established networks and their longer presence in Glasgow's underworld, matched them weapon for weapon. Police intelligence units, monitoring these developments, grew increasingly concerned. The traditional gang conflicts in Glasgow had been brutal but localized and often spontaneous. This felt different, more organized, more deliberate, more reminiscent of the structured mafia-style conflicts seen in other European cities. The feud remained largely beneath the surface until late 2006, when Kevin "Gerbil" Carroll decided to send an unmistakable message to the Lyons family. Under cover of darkness, Carroll drove to a cemetery where the family of Eddie Lyons Jr. had buried his younger brother years earlier. The 8-year-old boy had died of leukemia, a tragedy that had devastated the family. Carroll located the grave and deliberately toppled the headstone, shattering it. This act of desecration was not about drugs or money. It was pure psychological warfare, an attack on family honor designed to provoke an emotional response. When Eddie Lyons Jr. learned what had been done, witnesses later reported, he was consumed with rage. The destruction of his brother's memorial transformed the conflict from a business dispute into something far more personal and far more dangerous. Revenge became not just a matter of street credibility, but a family obligation. On a cold afternoon in December 2006, that revenge arrived at Apple Row Motors, a family-run garage in Lamb Hill that was frequented by Lyons associates. Two men in long black coats walked calmly onto the forecourt, where several people were working on vehicles and socializing. Without warning, they produced handguns and opened fire in broad daylight. The sound of gunshots echoed across the industrial estate as workers and bystanders dove for cover. When the shooting stopped, Michael Lyons, Eddie Jr.'s cousin and a mid-level figure in the family operation, lay dead, and 2 others were seriously wounded. The hitmen walked back to their waiting vehicle and drove away, leaving behind a scene of carnage that would dominate Glasgow's headlines for weeks. Police quickly identified the shooters as Daniel family foot soldiers, allegedly acting on Carroll's orders. The Apple Row ambush represented a point of no return. The Lyons-Daniel feud had erupted into open warfare on Glasgow's streets, and the body count had begun. Michael Lyons' funeral drew hundreds of mourners, family members, friends, criminal associates, and ordinary residents of the neighborhoods where the Lyons family had roots. The service was heavy with barely suppressed rage. Through gritted teeth, family members swore revenge. Eddie Lyons Jr. in particular made it clear to those close to him that Kevin Carroll would pay for what had been done. But the Daniel family, emboldened by the successful hit, was far from backing down. Carroll himself became more aggressive, employing tactics that earned him notoriety even among hardened criminals. He allegedly orchestrated abductions of Lyons' associates. Men would disappear from the streets for hours or days, returning beaten and traumatized, often too frightened to cooperate with police. These incidents became known in Glasgow's underworld as alien abductions, a darkly ironic reference to the sudden, inexplicable vanishing of victims who would reappear with stories of violence and threats. Carroll's men also targeted properties linked to the Lyons family, conducting arson attacks and drive-by shootings designed to keep the pressure constant. Glasgow's tabloids, always attentive to gang violence, began running near-daily updates, dubbing it an all-out gangland feud and speculating on who would be targeted next. The tension reached its peak on a bitter January afternoon in 2010 when Kevin Gerbil Carroll met his end in one of the most audacious gangland assassinations Scotland had ever witnessed. Carroll had driven to an Asda supermarket in the suburb of Robroyston, a location he presumably considered safe. Busy, public, full of witnesses, and far from the traditional gang territories. It was early afternoon, and the parking lot was crowded with shoppers loading groceries into their cars, families with children, elderly couples making their weekly shopping runs. Carroll parked his Audi and was either sitting in the driver's seat or had just exited the vehicle when a masked gunman appeared, moving with purpose and speed. Witnesses later told police that the assailant approached Carroll's car without hesitation, raised a handgun and fired repeatedly at close range. The entire attack lasted approximately 25 seconds. Carroll was hit multiple times, slumping in his seat as the gunman turned and ran to a waiting getaway vehicle. Panicked shoppers screamed and scattered, parents shielding their children, elderly witnesses frozen in shock. Within minutes, the parking lot was a crime scene swarming with police vehicles and ambulances, but for Kevin Carroll, it was already too late. He was pronounced dead at the scene, his body sprawled in the Audi, surrounded by shell casings and shattered glass. The brazenness of the Asda assassination stunned Scotland. This was not a late-night hit in a dark alley or an ambush in a known gang area. This was a calculated killing in broad daylight at a family supermarket carried out with military precision in front of dozens of civilians. Police Scotland launched one of its most intensive investigations in years, combing through CCTV footage, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, and leveraging intelligence networks within Glasgow's criminal community. Suspicion immediately fell on the Lyons faction, and specifically on Ross Monaghan, Eddie Lyons Jr.'s closest friend and a loyal Lyons foot soldier. Monaghan, who had allegedly been involved in the original 2001 cocaine theft that sparked the feud, had ample motive for revenge. Prosecutors believed they could connect him to the planning and execution of Carroll's murder, and in the months following the assassination, Monaghan was arrested and charged with murder. The trial, which began in 2012, gripped Scotland, with media outlets providing daily coverage and the public following every development. The prosecution presented evidence suggesting Monaghan had coordinated the hit as payback for Michael Lyons' death and the various attacks the Daniel family had carried out. But despite the high-profile nature of the case and the resources dedicated to the prosecution, key evidence proved insufficient to secure a conviction. In a dramatic turn, Ross Monaghan was acquitted of murder in 2012 and walked free from court with a smile, surrounded by supporters. The Daniel family was furious. Their most feared enforcer was dead, and no one would be held legally accountable. On Glasgow streets, the verdict was interpreted as a major victory for the Lyons faction. They had eliminated the Daniel family's top lieutenant and navigated the criminal justice system successfully. Rather than cooling tensions, Monaghan's acquittal seemed to embolden both sides. The 2010s saw the feud enter a new and even more chaotic phase, characterized by frequent tit-for-tat violence that became almost routine. Cars were firebombed in midnight attacks, their owners waking to find charred shells on their driveways. Drive-by shootings erupted outside pubs and gyms where gang members were known to frequent, bullets spraying facades and shattering windows. In one particularly brutal incident, Lyons affiliates allegedly forced a Daniel family member's car off the road on a highway, then jumped out with blades slashing the victim's face in what witnesses described as a modern-day Glasgow smile, a horrific facial wound that required extensive reconstructive surgery and left permanent scars. The victim, though he survived, was so traumatized he refused to cooperate with police, a common pattern in these attacks where fear of further retaliation kept victims silent. The Daniel side responded with equal ferocity. Foot soldiers targeted Lyons' safe houses with gunfire, riddling buildings with bullets in the dead of night. Crude pipe bombs were planted outside the homes of known associates, devices that sometimes detonated and sometimes were discovered by bomb disposal units before they could cause harm. Each incident seemed to beget the next in an endless cycle. A bombing led to a shooting, which led to an arson attack which prompted another bombing. Police resources were stretched thin as they tried to prevent escalations, protect potential targets, and investigate each new crime. Community leaders in affected neighborhoods pleaded for intervention, but the gang members themselves showed no interest in mediation or peace talks. The feud had taken on a momentum of its own, fueled by a toxic combination of revenge, pride, and the ongoing profits from drug trafficking that gave both sides the resources to continue fighting. In 2016, Jamie Daniel, the patriarch of the Daniel crime family, died of natural causes in a hospital bed, a surprisingly peaceful end for a man who had spent decades in Glasgow's violent underworld. Some hoped that his death might signal the end of the feud, that without the old guard to stoke the flames, the younger generation might find a way to make peace. Those hopes proved misplaced. The mantle of leadership simply passed to the next generation, and, if anything, the younger Daniel family members and their associates proved even more determined to settle scores. On the Lyons side, day-to-day operations were increasingly handled by Eddie Lyons Jr. and Ross Monaghan on behalf of Stephen Lyons, who had begun spending more time abroad to avoid both police attention and potential assassination attempts. The younger generation of gangsters had grown up immersed in this conflict. For them, the feud was not just a business dispute, but a defining part of their identity, a family legacy to be honored through continued violence. On a clear winter morning in January 2017, the feud's brutality nearly claimed Ross Monaghan in front of the most innocent of bystanders. Monaghan was dropping his 6-year-old daughter off at St. George's Primary School in Penilee, a routine morning ritual that thousands of parents across Glasgow performed daily. As he pulled into the school parking lot, surrounded by other parents and their children, a hooded gunman emerged from between parked cars. What happened next traumatized dozens of young children and their families. Gunfire erupted by the school gates, loud, sharp cracks that sent parents screaming and children crying in terror. Monaghan took a bullet to the shoulder and collapsed as the attacker fled on foot. Blood pooled on the pavement as parents shielded their children's eyes and frantically called emergency services. Teachers rushed out, trying to usher students inside, while also attending to Monaghan, who lay wounded but conscious. The unthinkable had happened. Gangland violence had spilled directly into a primary school environment, endangering children whose only crime was attending school that morning. Monaghan survived the shooting, though the psychological impact on the school community was profound. Police Scotland launched an immediate investigation, and public outcry was intense. Who would attempt such a hit in front of young children? investigators quietly suspected Mark Richardson, an Edinburgh-based crime boss who had forged an alliance with the Daniel faction. Richardson was a cocaine kingpin known for his brutal efficiency and willingness to use extreme violence to protect his interests and eliminate rivals. Intelligence suggested Richardson had orchestrated the school shooting, viewing Monaghan as a priority target, whose elimination would weaken the Lyons faction significantly. Richardson and an accomplice were arrested and charged in connection with the attack, but legal complexities intervened. Charges against Richardson were eventually dropped due to insufficient evidence, though he did serve time on a lesser firearms charge. On Glasgow streets, however, many believed Richardson had been behind the trigger, or at least the planning, and this would not be forgotten by the Lyons camp. The attempted murder at the school gates marked a turning point for Ross Monaghan personally. It became clear that remaining in Scotland meant living under constant threat of assassination, with the danger extending even to his family. Monaghan made a fateful decision. He would leave Scotland and seek refuge in Spain. The Costa del Sol, Spain's southern Mediterranean coast, had long been a haven for British criminals seeking to escape UK law enforcement or rival gangs. The warm climate, large expat community, relatively relaxed law enforcement atmosphere and geographic distance from Britain made it attractive for men like Monaghan who wanted to enjoy their ill-gotten wealth without constantly looking over their shoulders. Monaghan settled in Fuengirola, a resort town popular with British tourists and retirees, and even opened an Irish pub, an establishment that catered to expats craving familiar food, drink, and sports broadcasts from home. It seemed like an ordinary, peaceful retirement from Glasgow's violence. Eddie Lyons Jr. also began spending more time in Spain, similarly wary that he remained a target in Scotland. By the late 2010s, many top-tier figures on both sides of the feud had either been imprisoned or gone into exile abroad. Stephen Lyons, the Lyons family boss, quietly relocated overseas, reportedly moving between Spain and the Middle East, with intelligence reports placing him in Dubai when UK police pressure grew particularly intense. The Daniel faction suffered internal power struggles following Jamie Daniel's death, but one figure was rising fast, bridging the gap between the old generation and the new: Ross Miami McGill. To casual observers, McGill might have appeared to be just another young Scottish expat enjoying luxury abroad. Designer clothes, expensive cars, an address in Dubai's glittering marina district. But behind the flashy exterior, Ross McGill was cementing his role as a formidable crime boss in his own right. Nicknamed Miami for his preference for loud, colorful shirts and possibly a stint in the United States, McGill was a tech-savvy criminal who had grown up admiring old-school gangsters but understood the power of modern technology and international networking. He built his own crew of loyal enforcers, many recruited from Glasgow and Edinburgh's housing estates, young men hungry for money, status, and the thrill of criminal life. McGill's crew adopted the name Tamo Junto, Portuguese for "we're together," a nod to the multicultural influences of international criminal networks and McGill's time abroad. These young men became McGill's strike force back in Scotland, willing to carry out violent attacks on his orders, even when he was thousands of miles away in Dubai. Crucially, Ross McGill was not bound by blood loyalty to either the Lyons or Daniel families, which gave him flexibility to forge alliances based on mutual benefit rather than family obligation. He played a puppet master role, cultivating relationships with remnants of the Daniel clan and other gangland figures for strategic advantage. Intelligence reports suggested McGill had assembled an informal war council, a group of top-tier crime lords scattered across different countries, some in Dubai alongside him, some in Spain, some even coordinating from inside Scottish prisons. Among them were allegedly figures who had once been loyal to Jamie Daniel, as well as former rivals who now saw common cause against shared enemies. In the fluid, profit-driven modern underworld, yesterday's adversaries could become today's partners against a mutual foe. That foe, increasingly, was Mark Richardson, the very man suspected in the Monaghan school shooting. Mark Richardson had built a criminal empire that extended from Edinburgh's affluent suburbs deep into European drug trafficking networks. A cocaine baron who operated with ruthless efficiency, Richardson retained significant influence, and a network of soldiers even after multiple brushes with law enforcement. As McGill's star rose, a deadly rivalry developed between the two men. By 2023, an all-out shadow war was raging in Edinburgh, Scotland's capital city. A string of arson attacks targeted properties linked to Richardson's associates. Expensive cars reduced to charred metal skeletons on driveways, houses firebombed in the dead of night. Drive-by shootings and car bombings became alarmingly frequent. Richardson's associates retaliated, allegedly hunting for members of McGill's Tam Junto crew, vowing to eliminate them in the desert or wherever they could be found, according to intercepted communications. Edinburgh, traditionally quieter than gang-heavy Glasgow, was suddenly engulfed in violence that indicated the battle had become truly national and international in scope. What made this new phase of gang warfare particularly challenging for law enforcement was the sophisticated use of technology. Unlike the old days of tapped landlines and whispered conversations in pub backrooms, this generation of gangsters embraced encrypted communications. Encrypted phones and messaging applications, particularly Signal and Telegram, became the lifeline of criminal syndicates. These apps offered end-to-end encryption that made intercepting and decoding messages extremely difficult for police, even with court-authorized surveillance. Inside prison cells, smuggled smartphones allowed incarcerated gang members to remain active participants in the conflict. At HMP Perth, a facility holding several high-profile gang figures, prison authorities repeatedly discovered illicit mobile devices during cell searches. On these tiny screens, under the dim light of a prison bunk, gang bosses could coordinate attacks outside, selecting targets, arranging weapons deliveries, scheduling operations, all while supposedly isolated from the outside world. Orders were typed in coded language via encrypted apps, making it nearly impossible for authorities to intervene before violence occurred. It was as if prison walls no longer existed. The feud raged on through text messages shielded by military-grade encryption. Criminal networks also turned to social media in unexpected and disturbing ways. Gang members knew police monitored their communications, so they found creative avenues to taunt rivals and project strength. Teenagers affiliated with Tam Junto began posting videos on TikTok, short clips showing wads of cash, expensive watches, and sometimes weapons, set to drill rap music and accompanied by slang-filled captions that mocked their enemies. These videos were public enough to be seen by rivals, but cryptic enough to avoid outright self-incrimination. It was psychological warfare conducted via hashtags and 15-second videos. Each post became both a recruiting tool for wannabe gangsters impressed by the lifestyle and a provocation to rival factions. What had once been handled in smoky backrooms, threats, boasts, displays of power, now played out on social media platforms accessible to anyone with a smartphone. In one particularly chilling instance, after a violent assault, masked youths posted a video from inside a safe house, their faces obscured by emoji stickers, laughing while brandishing a blood-stained machete. The caption referenced local slang for their enemies and included a dark joke about Kevin Carroll's nickname Gerbil. Within hours, that video circulated through WhatsApp groups across Glasgow's underworld, a modern victory howl that authorities struggled to remove before it inspired copycat violence. Social media had transformed into both a battlefield and a trophy case for the young soldiers of this generational feud. By the spring of 2025, circumstances were aligning for a major strike. The Lyons faction, particularly Eddie Lyons Jr. and Ross Monaghan, had been living relatively quietly on Spain's Costa del Sol for several years, believing they had found genuine refuge far from Glasgow's violence. Monaghan's Irish pub in Fuengirola had become modestly successful, a relaxed establishment where British expats gathered to watch football matches and enjoy familiar comforts. It seemed like an ordinary life in the Mediterranean sun, but their enemies had neither forgotten nor forgiven. According to intelligence that emerged afterward, a secret summit took place in early 2025 among key figures opposed to the Lyons faction. The exact location remains disputed. Some reports suggest a backroom meeting in a Dubai hotel, others point to a villa on the Spanish coast, but what matters is that figures connected to Mark Richardson, remnants of the Daniel clan, and other criminal groups convened with one shared goal: Eliminate Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr. This summit of criminal minds set into motion an assassination plot that would involve multiple countries, sophisticated surveillance, and careful coordination. As the Champions League final, a massive European football match watched by millions, approached on May 31, 2025, those planning the hit knew this would be an ideal night to strike. Monaghan's pub would be packed with football fans, creating both cover and confusion. Intelligence suggests they had inside information. A source in Scotland tipped off the attackers that Eddie Lyons Jr. would be travelling to Fuengirola with friends that week for a golf holiday, and that he and Ross would certainly gather at the pub for the big match. The plotters secured a professional hitman, a Liverpool-born contract killer who was flown into Spain specifically for the job. But the operation required more than just a shooter. It needed real-time surveillance to confirm the targets would be present and vulnerable. This is where an unusual element entered the plan. A crew of 7 women from North Glasgow. These women were known in criminal circles not for violence, but for their expertise in shoplifting and pickpocketing. They were seasoned thieves who could blend into tourist environments without raising suspicion. Middle-aged, ordinary-looking, precisely the kind of people who could observe targets in public spaces without attracting attention. They were recruited, flown to Spain, and given a specific mission: identify, track, and monitor Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr. in the days leading up to the hit. In the week before the Champions League final, these female spotters moved through the Costa del Sol's bars, cafes, and beaches, shadowing Monaghan and Lyons as they went about their daily routines. The women even obtained prepaid mobile phones that had been stolen from unsuspecting British holidaymakers in nearby resort towns weeks earlier. Why use stolen phones rather than simply purchasing new prepaid devices? Because stolen phones provided an extra layer of untraceability. They were already associated with innocent victims whose identities could muddy any investigation. These burner phones became the communication tools for the surveillance operation, with the spotters relaying updates via encrypted signal messages to the coordination team. On the evening of May 31st, as the Champions League final played out on screens across Europe, Monaghan's Irish pub was heaving with customers. Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr. sat among the crowd, watching the match, drinking pints, enjoying what they believed was a safe, normal evening. The female spotters were positioned at different points throughout the pub, occasionally snapping surreptitious photos with their phones, confirming identities, tracking movements. Outside, the hired killer waited in a vehicle, engine idling, ready to move on command. The spotters used their stolen phones to send encrypted messages via signal, ensuring real-time coordination that couldn't be easily intercepted by law enforcement. When the final whistle blew and the pub erupted in cheers and applause, one of the spotters, posing as just another intoxicated tourist, stepped outside and transmitted the final signal. The targets were in the open near the entrance, vulnerable. What happened next was captured on grainy CCTV footage that would later be analyzed frame by frame by Spanish police and international investigators. The masked gunman burst through the pub entrance, a handgun raised and ready. Ross Monaghan, perhaps sensing danger in that split second before the shooting began, attempted to dive behind a table, scrambling for any cover. The gunman unleashed multiple shots in rapid succession. Monaghan was struck several times, one round tearing into his chest as he fell. Eddie Lyons Jr., who had been standing closer to the doorway, took a fatal shot almost instantly and collapsed. The pub descended into chaos. Patrons dove under tables, glasses and bottles shattered on the floor. Screams echoed through the confined space. The entire attack lasted mere seconds. The assassin turned and sprinted back toward the street, where an accomplice, possibly one of the female spotters, waited in a getaway vehicle. They sped off into the darkness, disappearing down Fuengirola's narrow streets, while inside the pub, panic and horror reigned. Eddie Lyons Jr. was motionless, already beyond help. Ross Monaghan lay on the floor, grievously wounded, gasping for breath as blood pooled around him. In an extraordinary twist of fate, a British nurse who had been in the pub enjoying the match overcame her shock and rushed to Monaghan's side. Trained in emergency care, she cradled his head, applied pressure to his wounds, and spoke softly to him, trying to keep him conscious and calm. Other patrons pressed napkins and cloth against his injuries, desperately trying to stem the bleeding, while someone shouted for an ambulance in broken Spanish. The nurse held Monahan's hand, pleading with him to stay with her, to hold on, that help was coming. But his eyes were fading, his grip weakening. By the time Spanish paramedics arrived and pushed through the crowd of traumatized witnesses, both Ross Monahan and Eddie Lyons Jr. were pronounced dead at the scene. Two lifelong friends, veteran gangsters who had survived decades of Glasgow's brutal underworld, had been executed together on foreign soil, their blood mingling on the tiles of a holiday pub thousands of miles from home. The aftermath was immediate and far-reaching. Spanish police, the Guardia Civil, swarmed Fuengirola, establishing a major crime scene and launching a high-profile murder investigation. The story dominated headlines across Scotland, Spain, and the broader UK. Images of the pub cordoned off with police tape, witness statements describing the terror, and speculation about who was responsible. Locals on the Costa del Sol, particularly the large British expat community, reacted with a mixture of fear and grim resignation. Gangland violence had once again followed British criminals to the Spanish coast, reminiscent of the Kinahan-Hutch-Irish cartel feud that had similarly spilled blood on Spanish streets in previous years. Scottish authorities, collaborating with Interpol and Spanish police, quietly began investigating whether this double murder was connected to the long-running feud in Scotland. Publicly, Police Scotland issued statements indicating there was no intelligence suggesting a direct link between the Costa del Sol murders and recent gang activity in Scotland, a carefully worded line likely intended to calm public anxiety. But privately, detectives understood perfectly well that this was an escalation of the Lyons-Daniel feud, now operating on a truly international scale. Within days of the assassinations, one suspect was in custody. Michael Riley, a 44-year-old man from Liverpool, was arrested by British police at a port in England, accused of being the hired hitman who pulled the trigger in Fuengirola. Riley had allegedly fled Spain immediately after the shooting, crossing into Portugal and then making his way back to the UK, but an international warrant issued by Spanish authorities caught up with him. He denied any involvement and fought extradition proceedings, hiring lawyers to contest being sent to Spain to face murder charges. The legal battle would drag on for months, leaving many questions unanswered about exactly who had planned the operation, how much had been paid, and which criminal factions had cooperated in arranging the hit. Intelligence reports indicated that multiple organized crime groups had indeed cooperated, a rare alliance unified by their shared desire to eliminate Monahan and Lyons, who were both close relatives and associates of key Lyons family figures. It was the kind of coordination that can only emerge from deep mutual hatred and careful negotiation in the shadows, with trust sealed by the promise of mutual benefit. Back in Scotland, the impact of the Costa del Sol bloodbath reverberated through the underworld like a thunderclap. For the Lyons side, it represented a devastating blow. Two of their most senior and experienced operatives were gone, murdered in what should have been a safe haven. Stephen Lyons, still in hiding somewhere abroad, was reportedly furious and heartbroken, concerned that his faction now appeared weakened and vulnerable to further attacks. For the Daniel camp and their allies, including the Richardson and McGill factions, the successful hit was a moment of grim satisfaction, proof that no one from the Lyons side was beyond reach, even in exile. But satisfaction was tempered by anxiety. Everyone involved knew that retaliation was virtually certain. In the smoky pubs and quiet corners of Glasgow and Edinburgh, whispers of revenge began immediately. Who would be targeted next? Where and when would the Lyons faction strike back? Funerals for Ross Monahan and Eddie Lyons Jr. were held in Scotland under heavy police surveillance. Over 500 mourners attended, a who's who of Scotland's criminal underworld, alongside ordinary friends and family members whose lives had been touched by these men beyond their gangster identities. The atmosphere was tense, with attendees dressed in black suits and dark sunglasses, many glancing nervously at their surroundings. It was as much a show of strength and solidarity as a memorial service. Police intelligence units photographed and documented everyone in attendance, aware that the gathering represented a concentration of criminal figures rarely seen in one place. Anonymous threats had circulated in the days leading up to the funerals, warnings that gangland figures attending might themselves become targets. Few doubted that tit-for-tat killings on Scottish soil were imminent. The question was not if, but when and whom. That summer of 2025, violence escalated in unpredictable and savage ways. In the quiet suburb of Rutherglen on Glasgow's outskirts, just before dawn one September morning, residents were jolted awake by screams echoing from a block of flats. A masked gang of young men had kicked in the door of a ground-floor flat occupied by a 50-year-old man and his dog. Armed with machetes and baseball bats, the gang launched a frenzied attack. The narrow hallway became a blood-slicked gauntlet as they slashed at the victim, repeatedly shouting accusations. Claiming he had helped set up Lyons associates to be killed, perhaps by providing information to enemies or cooperating with the faction responsible for the Costa del Sol hit. The victim's dog, a loyal companion, barked frantically and tried to protect its owner, only to be struck by a glancing blow from a machete itself. The attack was brutal but brief. The assailants delivered their message of violence and fled before police could respond, leaving the man bleeding profusely and the dog whimpering in pain. Neighbors who had peered through peepholes or cracked their doors saw the attackers fleeing down the street, still masked, disappearing into the early morning darkness. Within hours, something extraordinary happened that illustrated how deeply social media had become integrated into gang warfare. Footage of the aftermath appeared on TikTok. The video, apparently filmed by one of the attackers during their escape, showed a gloved hand holding a machete with blood dripping from the blade. A distorted voiceover said, "That's what you get, don't play with us." The next frame was simple text on a black screen. Tamo Junto claims another. No one safe. The clip was taken down after approximately 24 hours, but by then it had circulated across countless Facebook pages, WhatsApp groups, and encrypted chat channels. The message was clear and brazen. Ross McGill's Tamo Junto crew was openly claiming responsibility for the Rutherglen machete attack, framing it as both retaliation for perceived betrayals and a warning to anyone who might cooperate with rival factions. They had weaponized social media as a tool of psychological intimidation, amplifying the fear and impact of their violence far beyond the immediate physical attack. Miraculously, the Rutherglen victim survived his injuries, as did his dog, which required veterinary treatment including stitches for its wounds. But the psychological impact of the attack, combined with its viral social media broadcast, was profound. People living in gang-affected neighborhoods felt that no one was truly safe, not even a low-level associate or someone merely suspected of talking to rivals. Violence could arrive at anyone's doorstep, and the perpetrators might live stream or post the aftermath for the world to see, turning brutality into social media content. This represented a disturbing evolution in how gang conflicts played out, where once such attacks would be whispered about in pubs or reported in newspapers days later. Now they were broadcast in real time by the attackers themselves, creating a climate of fear that transcended geographic boundaries. Meanwhile, Mark Richardson and his closest associates went to ground. Spanish police named Richardson's Edinburgh-based organization and high-ranking Daniel family figures as persons of interest in the Costa del Sol double murder. Shortly after these reports emerged, intelligence suggested that several of these individuals had fled Scotland, possibly boarding flights to Dubai or other havens beyond easy European law enforcement reach. Richardson was said to be moving carefully between safe locations, constantly looking over his shoulder, aware that he was now a marked man. Underworld chatter indicated he had placed bounties on members of Ross McGill's War Council, offering significant sums for information leading to their locations or, more ominously, for carrying out attacks against them. The feud was no longer a simple two-sided conflict between Lyons and Daniel families. It had fractured into a multi-sided war involving McGill's Tamo Junto crew, Richardson's Edinburgh network, remnants of the original Daniel faction, and various freelance criminals willing to align with whoever offered the best opportunity for profit. Through late 2025, Scotland experienced a disturbing surge of incidents linked to this evolving conflict. In Edinburgh, vehicles belonging to family members of known gangsters were torched outside their homes in the dead of night. Luxury cars reduced to smouldering wrecks, a message of intimidation and a demonstration that no one's family was off limits. These attacks were likely carried out by McGill's operatives, targeting anyone connected to Richardson's network. In Glasgow, a shooting at a takeaway restaurant narrowly missed a young Lyons associate. Bullets peppered the shopfront as customers inside dove for cover. Hands screamed, shattering the illusion of safety even in seemingly neutral public spaces. And in the shadows, prison-based coordination continued unabated. At HMP Perth, guards conducting a surprise cell search discovered a cache of contraband that revealed the extent of incarcerated gang members' ongoing influence. Miniature smartphones, SIM cards wrapped in plastic and hidden inside containers of protein powder, and handwritten notes containing phone numbers and code words. Investigators believed a network of inmates allied to various factions had been coordinating operations outside prison walls, possibly including guiding the team of female spotters who had tracked Monaghan and Lyons in Spain, and certainly including identifying targets for attacks like the Rutherglen assault. Despite constant vigilance and regular searches, prisons remained a hub of covert criminal activity, what one frustrated detective dubbed a feud without walls. What began in 2001 as a relatively straightforward dispute over stolen cocaine has evolved into a hydra-headed conflict that shows no signs of ending. The Lyons-Daniel feud has proven remarkably adaptive, surviving the deaths of its original architects, the imprisonment of dozens of participants, and law enforcement efforts spanning multiple countries. Where once it was two clearly defined families trading blows, it has metastasized into an ever-shifting web of alliances involving old-school crime families, up-and-coming gangsters like Ross McGill cross-border cartels, and freelance contract killers who form a loose ecosystem bound together by vendetta profit and the intoxicating momentum of revenge. The feud has effectively bridged generations. Young men who were toddlers when Kevin Carroll desecrated that child's grave in 2006 are now the trigger pullers and getaway drivers indoctrinated into a legacy of hatred they know primarily through stories passed down and social media lore. Modern technology has fundamentally changed the mechanics of this conflict while leaving its emotional core untouched. Encrypted messaging applications have made coordination possible across continents while shielding communications from law enforcement interception. International travel allows gangsters to operate from Dubai or Spain while directing violence in Glasgow. Social media platforms enable psychological warfare through viral videos and taunting posts that reach thousands instantly. Yet despite these technological innovations, the underlying motivations remain ancient and visceral. Revenge for a slain friend, restoration of family honor, competition for control of lucrative drug markets, and the deep, irrational human need to answer violence with violence. A gangster in 2025 might use an iPhone and Telegram instead of a payphone and handwritten notes, but he kills for fundamentally the same reasons his predecessors did a century ago, because the other side killed his associate, stole his product, disrespected his family, or simply because failing to retaliate would mark him as weak. Territory in this modern gang conflict is as much digital as physical. Controlling a neighborhood street corner remains important for drug distribution, but claiming dominance through a viral TikTok video or demonstrating reach through an assassination in Spain carries its own strategic weight. The geographic scope of the feud has expanded dramatically beyond its origins in North Glasgow's housing estates. Its tentacles now reach Costa del Sol bars, where British expats gather Dubai high-rises, where crime lords live in luxury while coordinating operations via encrypted apps, and even prison cells, where incarcerated gang members wield smartphones to direct street-level violence. The Costa del Sol in particular has become both sanctuary and hunting ground for British gangsters, offering a sunny refuge with a large expat community, but ultimately proving that geographical distance provides no real safety when enemies are determined and well-resourced enough to strike anywhere. Dubai has emerged as a critical node in this internationalized gang conflict. The United Arab Emirates' glittering financial hub, with its luxury lifestyle, minimal extradition agreements with European nations, and historically relaxed scrutiny of wealthy foreigners' business affairs, has attracted figures like Stephen Lyons and Ross McGill. They live in expensive marina apartments, drive supercars, and present themselves as successful businessmen while coordinating criminal operations thousands of miles away. The UAE has recently increased pressure on foreign criminals using Dubai as a haven, but for years it functioned as a neutral ground where rivals from various conflicts could coexist, at least until those conflicts inevitably followed them. The Lyons Daniel Feud's internationalization reflects broader trends in organized crime, where drug supply routes link Scottish distributors to Spanish ports, which connect to Moroccan producers, which intersect with Irish financial networks and Eastern European logistics. A conflict that might once have been purely local now requires cooperation between Police Scotland, Spain's Guardia Civil, Interpol, and even law enforcement agencies in the UAE to effectively investigate and prosecute. Culturally, the Lyons versus Daniel saga has cast a long shadow over Scottish society. It has become a grim urban legend, retold in newspapers, true crime podcasts, and television documentaries, serving simultaneously as entertainment and cautionary tale about the cyclical nature of violence. The names of its victims and perpetrators are spoken like characters in a dark mythology. The Gerbil, Miami, Stephen Lyons, Jamie Daniel, Ross Monaghan, Eddie Lyons Jr. In Glasgow's working-class communities, perspectives on these figures vary widely. Some view them as folk heroes who achieved wealth and status, despite society's limitations, while others see them as the very architects of their neighborhoods, ongoing misery keeping communities trapped in cycles of fear, violence, and poverty. Teenagers growing up in these areas face a cruel choice: accept recruitment by one faction or another, offering loyalty in exchange for money and status, or attempt to stay neutral, often a futile effort, when gang members judge you by your postcode, your family connections, or simply who you're seen talking to. Social media has further complicated this dynamic, with some young people disturbingly glorifying gangsters through fan pages on TikTok and Instagram, celebrating their wealth and power while bullets fly in those same neighborhoods. This glamorization of gang life creates a recruitment pipeline. Impressionable teenagers see the designer clothes, expensive cars, and respect that gang members command, without fully understanding the violence, paranoia, and short life expectancies that come with that lifestyle. Community organizations and youth workers struggle to counteract these influences, offering alternatives like job training programs and mentorship, but find themselves competing against the immediate appeal of fast money and street credibility. The broader implications of the Lyons Daniel feud raise uncomfortable questions about society's ability to break cycles of violence. Despite hundreds of arrests over nearly 25 years, despite lengthy prison sentences handed down to major figures, despite surveillance operations and intelligence gathering, the feud persists. It morphs, adapts, and resurges with each generation. Police crackdowns succeed in removing individual actors from the streets, but seem unable to disrupt the conflict as fundamental momentum. Each major act of violence, the Asda assassination, the Costa del Sol hit, the Rutherglen machete attack, begets the next in an endless feedback loop of revenge. This raises difficult questions for policymakers and law enforcement. How do you break a vendetta that has become woven into the identity of the families and communities involved? Can technology be harnessed to prevent violence rather than merely document it after the fact? So far, every technological innovation, encrypted messaging apps, smartphones, social media platforms, has been rapidly co-opted by criminal networks to further their objectives, staying several steps ahead of law enforcement's ability to counter them effectively. There are no simple solutions. Some experts argue for focused deterrence strategies, where law enforcement directly engages with gang members, offering clear choices between continued violence and support for exit pathways, while simultaneously promising swift consequences for further criminal activity. Others advocate for deeper investment in the socio-economic conditions that create environments where gang culture thrives: poverty, lack of opportunity, failing schools, and hopelessness. Still others point to the need for international cooperation that matches the global reach of modern organized crime, with streamlined extradition processes, shared intelligence databases, and coordinated operations across borders. But implementing any of these approaches requires sustained political will, significant resources and time, all while young men continue to be recruited, weapons continue to circulate, and the body count continues to rise. Late in 2025, as autumn rain falls on Glasgow's streets, the conflict shows no signs of resolution. In a dim flat in one of the city's housing estates, a young man scrolls through encrypted telegram messages on his smartphone, awaiting instructions for the next operation. He is barely 20 years old, too young to remember when the feud began, but fully committed to honoring what he has been taught is a family obligation to seek revenge. In Dubai, Ross Miami McGill steps onto a balcony overlooking the city's glittering skyline, speaking into his phone with a simple directive to one of his lieutenants. It's time. The target might be one of Richardson's associates, or someone perceived as disloyal within McGill's own network. The specifics matter less than maintaining the appearance of strength and the willingness to use violence to enforce it. Somewhere outside Edinburgh, Mark Richardson checks the magazine of a handgun, ensuring it is loaded and ready, determined not to be caught off guard by enemies he knows are hunting him. And in a quiet suburb, an ordinary mother tucks her children into bed, whispering prayers that their walk to school tomorrow morning won't be interrupted by gunfire, that their neighborhood might somehow find peace. The Lyons' Daniel Feud has lasted a generation and threatens to consume another. Each time one side achieves what looks like decisive victory, killing a key rival, disrupting enemy operations, asserting dominance, the other side must answer with equal or greater force. Each funeral sows seeds for the next attack. It is a grim equilibrium of violence, sustained by wounded pride, the enormous profits generated by drug trafficking, and sheer stubborn vengeance that refuses to acknowledge any possibility of peace. Glasgow's historical gang conflicts eventually faded. The razor gangs of the 1930s became footnotes in history books. The ice cream wars of the 1980s are now cautionary tales. But those conflicts lacked the global connections and digital infrastructure that keeps this modern feud alive and spreading. Where once gang members were constrained by geography and limited communication methods, today they coordinate across continents via encrypted apps, launder money through international financial systems, and recruit through social media platforms that reach millions. In the end, the story of the Lyons and the Daniels is fundamentally a story of escalation, spiraling beyond anyone's control. What began with two friends stealing a shipment of cocaine in 2001 has metastasized into transnational murder plots involving female surveillance operatives, prison-based coordination, and encrypted communications. It illustrates how even the combined might of law enforcement agencies across multiple countries and the passage of more than 2 decades have struggled to extinguish the fires of a clan vendetta once it reaches a certain intensity. The conflict has consumed lives, destroyed families, traumatized communities, and spread violence from Glasgow housing estates to Spanish resort towns to the gleaming towers of Dubai. As this documentary draws to a close, 2 images linger. In Glasgow, graffiti spray-painted on a crumbling wall reads, "Lyons for life," a defiant declaration that this identity transcends mortality. And across the world in Fuengirola, Spain, a makeshift shrine of flowers still marks the spot outside Monaghan's pub where 2 lifelong friends were executed, with handwritten notes from strangers pleading, "No more violence." But the violence continues, because for those caught in this generational conflict, there seems to be no way out, no path to peace, only the next strike and the inevitable retaliation that will follow. The war goes on,